So anyway, we're looking forward to Jewish queens, and we'll monitor the questions and stop about halfway. So Anna, I leave it to you.
Okay, hi everybody. Hope you're having a good afternoon so far. I have a little bit, and I heard people were talking about the inevitable COVID conversation in terms of when was the last time you got your haircut, and how sometimes we are looking, physically a little bit different than we did when all of this started in terms of certain expectations that we were comfortable with in the past in terms of especially things having to do with beauty. So I think that's a nice tie-in to the beginning part of our discussion. So as you know, so first of all, it's lovely to see everyone who I can see. As it is, though, I'm happy for you to see each other, but I'm going to concentrate on the slides in front of me that I'm going to post for you all to see in a minute. I think you get to see a little snippet of my face, but mostly I want us to think about big ideas and text and things like that. And so that's why I have them up on the screen in front of us. So I'm going to start off by sharing the screen. Now, this particular screen in front of me, can everyone hear me? There was something just weird with my voice, I think. I mean, my voice is a bit hoarse, but as long as the recording's working, okay, or the sound. I think so. Okay. Well, Anna will let me know if there's a problem, the other Anna.
Yep, it's all good.
Wonderful. Okay, so I usually start with something a little bit more serious, like a blue background. You'll see most of our slides look a little bit more serious than this. And it's a very serious topic that we're actually talking about today. But I thought I would start us off this way to make us think a little bit about stereotypes and stereotypes of what we think a Jewish queen might be like. And so I have this kind of cutesy crown, absolutely not historically correct, to start us off and to get us thinking, because I'm assuming that for many of you, when you think about queens and Judaism, that you might think about Queen Esther. So Queen Esther here is portrayed in kind of like a Orientalist style from a painter from the 1800s. And over here, I don't know who this little girl is. I just took the picture from the internet, but I think everyone recognizes this particular costume, the fancy dress, the headdress, and lots of costume jewelry, which is a classic kind of Queen Esther look for many of us and or our children or grandchildren, probably going back for a very long time. So when we think about Jewish queens, anyone who's at all somewhat affiliated with Judaism, probably this comes to mind. And that's fine. But interestingly, this is not who we're going to be talking about today. When we think about, and that's back to the idea of stereotypes, when we think about Queen Esther, I think most of us tend to think about, getting dressed up on Purim, a female heroine, yay, who's able to save her people, belief in God helped her through. Beautiful, beautiful, and wonderful ideas. However, if you ever looked at the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, in detail, you will see the story is a lot more complex than the one that we usually tell our children. Not something I'm going to do today. Perhaps we could devote a whole other class to that one day. But, there's a lot of problems if we're looking at Queen Esther as a role model. Think of the issue of, in order to save her people, she had to marry a non-Jewish guy. I mean, he was the king, but he wasn't Jewish. Or think about this whole beauty pageant thing, like we tell our children. I mean, really, the king was trying her out sexually for the night, like he was any other women that wanted to kind of audition for the role of queen. Also, not exactly kind of role model for the ideal kind of relationship that I think that we want to portray for our children, our daughters in particular. So Queen Esther is a queen that she is Jewish, but she is not the queen of a Jewish kingdom. right? She's queen of Persia. And so I just kind of want to put her in our mind right now. But for the most part, I would say she's an exception, in that she was queen and that she was able to do something positive. Because unfortunately, we're going to now spend quite a bit of time on some negative ideas having to do with queens. The first two in particular, queens that were actually queens of Jewish kingdoms, as opposed to Esther, who, of course, was not the queen of a Jewish kingdom. All right. So, as I said, even though we started off all sparkly with, fancy crowns and costumes and things like that, I'm going to have to take us from that kind of excitement, which might not even be so realistic, and take us down a notch. And we're going to start with something we don't usually start with, but a point of Jewish law. And so this is a point of Jewish law that is brought forward by Maimonides, or Rambam, one of the most important thinkers in Judaism, from all different perspectives. I'm certain that you've heard of him. And one of the things that he did, aside from being a philosopher and a doctor and everything else, was he's a codifier of law that had come before, that was written out in a very complex way. And he took some of those laws and he kind of laid them out in one of his magnum opuses called the Mishna Torah, in a kind of more organized way than the laws had been presented before in the Talmud. In one of those laws is found in a book called The Laws of Kings and Wars. Okay, there's Jewish law of expectations of how kings should act, how we should act, conduct ourselves in the case of war. In one of the first laws that are in that book, it says, a woman may not be appointed queen. So you're going to say, Anna, what are we talking about today? Well, this obviously wasn't really adhered to all the time. Most of the time it was, actually, though, and I thought it was important to understand it. So why is he saying this? As it says, you shall be free to set a king upon yourself, a king and not a queen. All right? And then it adds, just to be clear, a woman may not be appointed in any position in Israel, only a man. Okay, those are still Rambam's words in translation, of course, but he makes it very, very clear. So what he does here, and what he's not the first one to do in Jewish history, is to read into a verse in Deuteronomy, in the book of Dvarim, that talks about how the Jews are meant to organize themselves once they finally get through the desert, where they are at that point, and reach the land, and how they're supposed to conduct themselves socially and politically. In the ideal world, of course, everyone would follow the Torah and be good and perfect people, and you wouldn't need a system of government. We probably don't live in that ideal world, though. And so, therefore, we need a system of government. And of course, in ancient times, that was generally a monarchy. And so when that kind of ruling was put forward, that we are allowed to set for ourselves a king if we feel that we need one, that the Midrash here, quoted by Rambam, adds, by the way, it just says king on purpose. Don't assume it means king or queen or king and queen. It says king, full stop. And therefore, we are meant to infer from this, logically infer, that there is no such thing as a queen in Judaism. All right? Now we're going to see examples where that wasn't. Before we do that, though, I think we need to just remember a statement, a definition that I think we're all familiar with, as one that we've used before. But I think it's important to bring it as a dictionary definition because it's a straightforward description of society, of how society can be and usually is, even though it's generally used in a negative way. The patriarchy. And if you want to use it that way, that's totally fine. I might agree with you. But either way, I think it's important to understand this system, because when we're talking about monarchy, which we are, which obviously is not an egalitarian system to begin with, right? You have the king and then you have everybody else, or you have the monarch and you have everyone else. But in addition to that, we have another kind of system lurking in the background, namely the patriarchy. That society as we know it in almost every place in the world and throughout all generations has been organized as a patriarchy, where it says here, social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family. So it starts out in a micro level. And then that leads to the fact that because the father is in charge, that there's then legal and financial dependence of everyone else, women and children, on the father. And that because of that, the father and the father's line becomes very important. And so descent and inheritance goes by the male line. We talked about this a little bit last time too, when we talked about Benot Tzlafchad and the daughters of Tzlafchad, and inheritance. All right, so, and then that by extension goes from the family to society. So we're talking about monarchy, which is non-egalitarian, and then we're talking about also a patriarchal society, which is definitely going to favor the men for any kind of ruling position. All right, I'm going to now share with you a Midrash from Esther Rabbah. So I told you before we weren't talking about Queen Esther, but this is a particular Midrash based on the book of Esther, and it actually mentions another queen who is in that same book, which again, I could probably do a whole class on, but we're not going to do much on her today because her name is Vashti, and our concentration today is not on biblical queens, but rather on Jewish queens, and Vashti was not Jewish. So regardless, we have a list of 4 queens here that you see I've highlighted in the pink, and there's a statement here made about them. So first of all, the statement is based on a verse from the first chapter of the book of Esther, when it says, in addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women. And there's a whole bunch of midrashim that I have not quoted for you here, that try to understand what is going on with this phrase, because it starts off with this phrase, in addition, but it didn't really have anything before it that it seems like it was in addition to. So it goes through all different kinds of things that you could learn, that the rabbis learn from this phrase just by that little addition of those words in the beginning, in addition, something else, something new to learn about Queen Vashti. And so in order to do that, in the ways that rabbis often do, they bring a quotation from a different biblical verse. This one is a poetic biblical verse. It's difficult to understand. It's here from Isaiah. You see it in front of you. My people's rulers are babes. It is governed by women. We don't exactly know what that means, but it is something in the negative. Okay, again, in a patriarchal system, not a surprise to us that being governed by women would be considered to be something bad. All right. Now, as a continuation of that commentary, it says, another interpretation, it is governed by women. 4 women gained rulership in the world, and they were Jezebel and Athaliah from Israel, and Semiramis and Vashti from the Gentile nations of the world. And from the rabbi's perspective, Vashti is evil. And what we're going to go on and see how the first 2 listed, the ones Jezebel and Athaliah, are evil as well. This third one happens to be the rabbi's understanding, at least it's not in the Bible, of the name of Nebuchadnezzar's wife. So Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylonian king responsible for the destruction of the first temple. So obviously a bad guy in the rabbi's mindset, that this was his wife's name. So that she and Vashti are considered evil, as well are Jezebel and Athaliah. Those are the 2 that are going to be of interest to us at first, because they are the ones who are Jewish queens, okay, from Israel. Now, actually, I think I better just mention a little bit, just to be historically accurate. The title of our talk today is Jewish queens. The truth is that Jewish is a much later term, and it comes from the Greek. At this earlier time in biblical history, we really don't have Jewish. We have kingdoms. of people who would later become Jews. Israelites, or the children of Israel, we call them when they're in the desert. The Israelite nation, when they're a nation under King Saul, then King David, then King Solomon. I think you've heard of all of them before. But then that nation splits into two, Judah and Israel. So we have two kingdoms of what we call now Jews. And we're going to learn a little bit more about those kingdoms. And these were queens of those kingdoms. We're still in biblical times with that. Now, I think people have heard the term Jezebel before. I'm just going to play you a little clip. This is a famous song. I think many of you have heard of it before. So let's scroll ahead a little. Couldn't get to the words yet. There. Okay, you can dance a little bit. Okay, so it's talking about Jezebel being a devil. Okay, so we have to are going to try to understand a little bit more. There's also an old movie, I think from the 1930s or 40s, called Jezebel. This song actually was recorded even earlier by other singers. So there's a certain fascination with this concept of Jezebel being this very evil woman that we can see has come into pop culture. My suspicion is that that is not because necessarily of the story in the Tanakh, but rather that it is this idea of Jezebel is picked up by the New Testament, by Christians as well. And from there, I think it probably entered general culture. We'll get to that. Oh, no, that's the song again. We gotta go. We gotta leave the 1960s rock and roll behind and get into some Torah now. So, who was Jezebel? We learn about her from the first book of Kings from a few different chapters. She is a queen. Interestingly, though, again, we talked about what language and what different terms mean when we talk about Jews. We're going to have to think about that a little bit in terms of queens also. Because even though Queen Esther is called a queen, who we talked about before, both Jezebel here, and then we'll see soon her daughter Atalia, are described in a queenly fashion and even have some power that you would imagine a queen would have. They're actually not titled queen in the Bible itself, interestingly. In my mind, I'm thinking of that. I mean, maybe you guys know more about monarchy and how it works than I do, but I'm thinking a little bit now, and of course, watching The Crown, which I hope you all have, but thinking about the idea of Queen Elizabeth II, and that, of course, she doesn't have a king, right? She has Prince Philip. So the idea of titling someone and their roles and the importance of their roles is tremendously important in monarchies in general, and has all to do with the power structure and the lineage and the bloodlines and things like that. So Jezebel here acts as a queen. We'll see in many ways that she does, even though she is not titled queen by the Bible. Her husband is the king called Ahav, or Ahab in English, and he is the king of Israel. As we said, now at this point, the Jewish kingdom is split into two parts, Israel and Judah. So he's the king of Israel. And his wife, as I said, was Jezebel. She comes from royal lineage, interestingly, but not Jewish. She is the daughter or the princess of the Phoenician kingdom. Her father's name is Et Baal, which is obviously connected to the idol or the false god known as Baal. See, it says it right here. And Ahav, her husband, her Jewish husband, already was not perfect in how he was acting, but she really brought out the idolatry in him, and they both were involved in worshiping idols, okay, and in leading the country in that way. So obviously not seen as something positive. Okay, so now we have that there's a lot of political intrigue here. Okay, when you talk about kings and queens, there usually is. So when I spelled his name here in a weird way because it is sometimes spelled differently. But when the next king, okay, at this point Ahab is dead, and when the king Yoram saw this other guy came to approach him, okay, his name was Jehu, and in Jehu had been appointed by the prophet Elisha to overthrow the throne. Didn't like the fact that Ahab and now Ahab's son and Jezebel, who's still around, are leading the nation because they are idolaters. Okay. And so he approaches the king, and the king says to him, "Well, is all well, Jehu?" And then Jehu says, "How can everything be fine as long as your mother Jezebel carries on in her countless harlotries and sorceries?" So we have here, sexual things that are inappropriate, and then essentially being a witch, which is completely inappropriate, and not acceptable according to the Bible and according to Judaism. And so it's a huge insult, of course, to the queen mother, essentially at this time. And so the king actually seems to, I guess he recognizes that there's a threat now, and he runs. But Jehu actually is able to assassinate him. Then Jehu goes back to the geographical location, Jezreel, where their palace was. And Jezebel heard that there was now someone who had killed her son, the king. And she obviously knew something was up. And there's a famous, very kind of a famous vision of Jezebel here, of someone who painted her eyes with kohl, with some kind of blackened makeup around her eyes, dressed her hair, and looked out the window. She now knows her fate. She knows that this will be the end of her. And then when this person who had just assassinated her son enters the gate, she calls out, "Is all well, Zimri?" Now, Zimri is kind of a disparaging name that she uses to refer to him, talking about a different person involved in political intrigue who murdered the king. Okay, so she knows fully what's going to go happen here. He looked up toward the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And two or three eunuchs, these would have been people, like guards in her palace, leaned out towards him, like saying, basically, "We're with you," the new guy. And so the new guy says, "Throw her down." And they threw her down. Her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled on her. Okay. And then it goes on to say that she was buried. But before she was buried, the dogs actually wild dogs consume part of her carcass, her body, which would have been seen to be a huge, huge insult. And apparently, based on other incidents that happened with her, which we didn't talk about here, that there had been a prophecy that would be her end, that she would fall from being queen to being literally eaten by dogs, literally fall in this case, actually, that had been prophesied by Eliyahu Hanavi. And in fact, that prophecy came true, and that was her ending. And she is seen as someone who is responsible for all kinds of unethical and idolatrous practices, and seen as a really evil queen that appropriately met a very evil ending. Now, I don't know very much about the New Testament, but the concept of Jezebel here as being a woman who's not our Jezebel, but probably someone else who maybe that they nicknamed, used a name for Jezebel for another woman, was considered to be someone also who was involved with sexual immorality and inappropriate ritual situations, eating the meat sacrificed to idols, idolatry, and someone who refuses to repent. So I'm fairly certain that it's from this particular vision, this idea from the New Testament, that the concept of a Jezebel being someone involved in unrepenting sexual immorality probably got into the culture at large. Now, why rock and roll stars want to sing about her and be excited about her is a different psychological issue that we're not going to get into right now. So this is we're talking about lineages being important. This is the family tree of Ahav here that we talked about, and Jezebel. And you'll see right here in the middle that they have a daughter named Atalia. And that, in fact, is our next queen. I'm going to do this quickly, much more quickly, and then I'll take questions if there are any. So this Atalia, of course, she was a princess of Israel. We're talking about the kingdom of Israel. Interestingly, though, she became queen of Judah. Okay, as I said, there's two kingdoms, Jewish kingdoms at the time, that she was married off to the king of Judah to ensure peace between these two kingdoms. By the way, not successful, but an attempt at peace. She also had learned from her mother and the whole, I guess, zeitgeist around her to worship idols, and she did not rise above that to worship only the one true God. She stayed with the idol worshiping, a negative, obviously. Her husband was assassinated, and then there was others assassinating the royal family, a lot of bloodshed, some at her command even. So she's seen there, of course, as very unethical. The interesting thing is here is that then she acted alone as queen for 6 years, okay? So that was not true for Jezebel. Jezebel, even when her husband died, her son was king, and she was kind of like queen mother. In this case, Atalia acted alone as queen for 6 years, the only example we have of a Jewish queen of a Jewish kingdom in Jewish history, or in biblical history, let's say, biblical history. Unfortunately, not a great role model, though. And in the end, someone from the correct bloodline was found, a young descendant of the original king who had been kept in hiding, brought forward to take the throne. Atalia accused him of treason, and then she was executed because of it. Okay, also comes to a very nasty ending. All right, so these were our Jezebel and Atalia. These were the queens that we're talking about. They're being compared to, the woman who helped destroy the temple, and, the Babylonian queen, and to Vashti, who by the rabbis is generally seen as negative. So this is not a good picture of queens so far. I'm going to get you a good picture soon, though. But first, I'll see if there are any questions.
Okay, Anna, I don't see any questions in the chat section. I think everyone is just sort of listening to all of this, feeling a little negative that we don't have any, especially in 2021. However, there's always, I guess, hope going forward.
Yeah, no, I'm going to give you a good story next. I'm going to give you a positive next.
Okay, so let's see what happens next.
Okay. So next, we're going to take a look at our timeline because we are jumping from the biblical era. Okay, so just to remind everyone, we are jumping. Before we were talking about the times of the king. Oh, I'm sorry for these pop-ups. The kings and the prophets over here during the time when the first temple was still existed. So around, we see where it says here kings and prophets. Sorry for the pop-ups. And now we are going to jump tremendously over to the time of just before the Common Era started, the time of the Hasmoneans. And I'm going to remind you who the Hasmoneans were, not to worry. Okay, Hasmonean family tree. Okay, we're going to the story of Hanukkah now. Okay, so the story of Hanukkah, which is a post-biblical holiday. We have, these are in the family tree I was able to find for you online. I apologize, we have the Greek versions of a lot of these names here. You might be familiar with some of the more kind of Hebraicized versions of their names. For instance, the patriarch of the family here is Matityahu, right? Matityahu Kohen Gadol. He was the chief priest. Then we have his most famous son here, Judas Mattathias, or Yehuda HaMaccabee, Judah the Maccabee, along with his brothers. And they're the ones that, of course, fought the battles involved in the getting back the kingdom, getting back the country, as well as the temple from the Syrian Greeks who had possession of it, and then were responsible for repurifying the temple, rededicating it, and using it again. Okay, that's, as you know, the story of Hanukkah. But once the story of Hanukkah ended, the story continues with the we're now called the Hashmonaim in Hebrew, or the Hasmonean family. That Judah Maccabee did not survive all of the wars, but his brother Simon did, and went on to be the ruler of the Jews at that time. You'll see it's a little bit confusing here in terms of the dates, because remember, we're in BCE time, which means we're working in negatives, so we have to move backwards. Okay, so as you can see, we have different leaders of the Jewish people who are Hasmonean. We go down from Simon to John Hyrcanus the first. Okay, these names are sounding more and more Greek, by the way, because in fact, they, interestingly, I don't know if any of you know this, again, Hanukkah is a whole other story, but just though, even though the basic story of Hanukkah is the fights of the Jews against the Greeks and the Greek incursion into the land of Israel. As a matter of fact, as the descendants of Judah the Maccabee continued to rule in the land of Israel until a certain time we're going to get to in a minute, until what we're talking about, they actually became rather Greek-ish or Hellenized themselves, which is definitely portrayed in their names as well as in their actions and everything else. So we have John Hyrcanus here, and then we have his son, Judas Aristobulus the first, or Aristobulus the first, is the ruler, and he marries someone named Salame Alexandria. Okay, people have heard the name Salome before, also from the New Testament, not connected at all. Okay, this is Salome Alexandria, and and this is the star of our story, who we're going to talk about in a minute, but I'm just putting you in context in terms of the family tree here historically. Her first marriage, Aristobulus, dies. And so, though she's already connected to the royal family, so she ends up marrying his brother, Alexander Yanai in Hebrew, or Alexander Yanneus in Greek. And then that's kind of like where our story picks up. So right here where it says second marriage. So this Salame Alexandria is our next queen. Okay, so she is the only Hasmonean queen. And again, those Hasmoneans ruled over the land of Israel from the time of Hanukkah to her, basically. She's really the last of the Hasmonean rulers. So it's about 100 years or so. And I want to tell you a little more about her. So first of all, her name, oh, I had another picture for you here, and now it's gone. Oh, I've somehow lost it. Her name in Hebrew is Shlomtzion Hamalka. Some of you might have heard that name before because it's the name of a street in Jerusalem. I actually had a picture for you of the street sign. It seems to have disappeared from my slides. But Shlomtzion Hamalka. So beautiful. We can see her name in Greek, Salome Alexandra, or Alexander. But sometimes in Hebrew, she's called Shalom Zion, which is really two small words put together: Shalom, peace, and Zion, or Zion of Israel. So it turns out it was a relatively peaceful time for the people. Her name represents it as well. And she's seen as, to a certain extent, a successful queen. We need to learn a little bit more about that. So first of all, she's the only Hasmonean queen. She is, as I said, the wife and later successor of King Alexander Yanai, or Jannaeus. So the interesting thing is, at this point, there aren't really supposed to be kings in the land of Israel at this point. But the people are usually led by the head of the learned people, or maybe by the priests. But the topic or the concept of kind of king of monarchy has fallen by the wayside since the Second Temple was established. And that's the time period we're talking about here. However, as I told you before, the Hasmoneans, even though they were Jewish rulers of the Jewish people after the Hanukkah story, they took on Greek ways. And one of those Greek ways was they took on the idea of monarchy. And so the head now of their people they deemed was to be called a king. So she's a queen. You might say she might an illegitimate queen, not only because of the halakha that we counted, that we mentioned before from Rambam, but also because Jews aren't supposed to be calling themselves kings and queens at this point. Nevertheless, she did. Now, she comes from an important family. Not only is she married into the Hasmonean family, but her brother is the head of the Pharisees at the time. Now, Pharisees also is a term you might have heard in different contexts. It's usually used negatively, sometimes in Judeo-Christian society, because it's termed a negative term in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible. However, for Jews, it's a very positive. This is the group of people, the group of leaders at the time who would eventually kind of morph into the rabbis once the Second Temple was destroyed. So they're seen as a very positive. So there's another ruling group at the time that is in conflict with the Pharisees called the Sadducees. They had more power at the time when Alexander Yanai or Jannaeus was the king. But through a number of different decisions, which we won't get into right now, she when her husband dies, she becomes queen, and she decides to shift the power not only from him to her, but in terms of the other kind of ruling class, that the Sadducees would no longer have importance now, but that she would put her stamp of approval and her power behind the Pharisees. And it was a major shift in power in the society at the time. Okay, so since she put the Pharisees in power, it comes as no surprise that she is greatly praised in later rabbinic literature, as the rabbis are the heirs of the Pharisees. It's an interesting Midrash that we have about her here that's based on a seemingly innocuous verse from the book of Leviticus that says, "Then I shall give your rains in their proper times, and the earth shall yield its produce, and the tree of the field shall yield its fruit." And there's a Midrash that asks a question about, well, what are proper times for rain? I mean, you might think it's a season of rain. Of course, in Israel, that would be in the winter, but they want to know what the proper times would be. And in this case, there's actually a number of answers given, but then it says, well, it would be proper to rain at night rather than during the day, right? Because, of course, most of the world at that time was agriculturally based, and also they didn't have paved roads. Things were very muddy. And you need to work in the fields during the day. So it's better to rain at night, and all the more so to rain on Wednesday night, which is the night before market day. Market day is on Thursday morning, Monday and Thursdays. And so on Thursday morning, you're not going to work in the fields. You're going to the market, so you don't mind if it's wet. And then, of course, on Sabbath nights, everyone's home. Everyone's just going to go to shul the next day. And so that would be a great time for it to rain. Okay, when are we going to get to Salame Alexandria? It's a further description of that phrase, and it says, it happened in the days of Shimon ben Shattach, as I said, that's her brother, who is the head of the Pharisees, and in the days of Queen Shlemtza, okay, that's a different Hebrew variation of her name, that the rains descended from the nights of Sabbath to the nights of Sabbath until the wheat became like kidneys, the barley like olive stones, and the lentils were like golden dinars. So this sounds like some kind of a otherworldly, fantastical climate issue that's meant to, as we'll see here, reflect what's going on with the people. What's that phrase? When the weather reflects what's going on in a novel. Anyway, I can't remember. But here we have that it didn't only rain on Wednesday and on Saturday nights, it rained every single night. which meant that the ground was so fruitful that all of the fruits and seeds and everything else grew to extraordinary sizes, huge. So this idea of fruitfulness, which is seen as plenty, which is seen as good and wonderful and rewarding. And the idea is that the climate, which of course is controlled by God, is seen to be as a way of giving a stamp of approval to the people, but particularly the leaders of the people's actions, that because these leaders were good and therefore the people were good, that the reward was that the produce was extraordinary. And we know it was not just a mistake, some kind of climate change issue, that it was intentional, because it says also the sages at the time recognized that these were very special fruits. And so they tied some of them up, they preserved them in some way to show for future generations, to say, look, you see, when you're good, that, and when the leaders are good, that we're rewarded with plentiful fruits. And so, we should continue to act that way in the future. Now, I just want to talk a little bit. So it's very exciting that she's seen as positive. She puts the people who eventually become the rabbis in place. God rewards her and her kingdom by blessing them with, all this fruitfulness. So I just want to talk about her a little bit, though, as a queen, because historians have a bit of a disagreement about whether, was she good for the Jews or was she bad for the Jews, basically. She was Jewish, but. So I just want to look at her as a political leader for a second. The idea is, was she smart? Was she a good political leader or not? So politically savvy. Well, yes, because she reduced the importance of the Sadducees, who had supported her husband. They were seen generally as corrupt. And not only that, the idea is that the Pharisees were now becoming the leaders instead. And in fact, they ended up staying the leaders. And as I said, eventually became known, within the next generation as the rabbis, or within the next century, I would say. However, her end is not so great. I mean, nothing horrible happened to her in her death, like we read about those other evil queens. She died a normal death, but she was not so politically savvy. She had 2 sons, and apparently it was not clear who would rule after her, and she didn't leave direction about that. And because of her indecision, of course, she didn't realize this, but it led to a big turning point in Jewish sovereignty, basically, because her 2 sons fought so much about who should be king after her that they couldn't decide. And they ended up bringing in an outside power to help them decide and to support one or the other. That outside power was basically the superpower of the region, and that was Rome. And Rome then had permission to basically come in to the political system of the land of Israel. They were invited in. No war, no conquering, invited in to be part of the political system because of the mistake that her sons made, because of her indecisiveness and not making it clear which of them should rule in the future. So it seemed to be a negative about her leadership abilities. So that's my positives and excitements and interest about Salame Alexandria. Unfortunately, though, being a real person and being involved in the complexities of monarchy, she wasn't perfect either. Right. So I just gave you the family tree here again, so you could understand what we were talking about. So actually, I'm going to leave that here. So I gave you all my Jewish queens that we have. There really aren't any others. There's one who was actually a convert to Judaism in the time of the Mishnah. I'm going to leave her for another day because she fits into one of our other themes. I really thought this was the end of the story until I came across something just a few years ago myself. So it was, as you probably aren't surprised to hear, online. I'm involved, I follow all different kinds of Instagram, Facebook, all kinds of accounts having to do with women in Judaism. And as part of one of those postings that I saw a few years ago, there was a celebration or discussion, about Ethiopian Jews living in Israel. And Ethiopian Jews actually have a particular Jewish holiday called Sig, I think. I don't know how to pronounce it. It happens in the month of Cheshvan, in the Hebrew month of Cheshvan, which is soon after Sukkot. And it's a holiday for them. And they still celebrate it in Israel, Ethiopian Jews in Israel. And because of that, there was a posting in honor of that holiday about Ethiopian heritage, particularly about a Jewish Ethiopian queen who I had never heard of. And so I want to share her with you right now because I thought I knew all the queens. Here's the next one. So her name was Yodit, which is probably some variation of Yehudit or Judith of Ethiopia. She was an Ethiopian Jewish queen around the year 960 CE. So about 1,000 years after the last queen we just talked about, and of course in a totally different setting. She apparently ruled for 40 years. She married a Jewish Syrian prince who was also a military general. Now, I don't know anything about, Ethiopian history from the early Middle Ages or whatever, so I can't really give you the context, but nevertheless, I think this is a pretty fascinating idea. So she opened many trade routes. She led a military revolt and killed the Aksumite king in the desert, so some kind of rival kingdom. At that point, Ethiopian Jews were being forcibly converted to Christianity. She then, as part of this revolt, attacked the churches. Okay, I don't want to sound excited about that. It's horrible that she did that, but it's like, wow, that's interesting. And she burned them to the ground. The Christian monastery of Debre Damo, that's located in northern Ethiopia today, still bears scorch marks around its ceiling, and it's said to have been made by her armies by trying to burn down that building. And apparently to this day, women are forbidden to enter the monastery grounds unless they burn it down like she tried to do. So, and this sounds like, oh, it's a myth, it's an idea. No, there's actually documentation in non-Jewish Ethiopian records from this time period that talk about this particular queen and this particular revolt. Those are the queens I got for you. Lots of negatives and some interesting positives within the light of politics, right? I would love to say, oh, there's a queen that always did the right thing and was peaceful and we should all, but we're talking about leaders in the political arena. So things are different, thank God, than our day-to-day lives. I don't want to have to make any decision a queen is making, military or nationally or otherwise. But there are examples of the bad that we are meant to learn from to not be bad like that. And I would try to demonstrate to you that we have some stories that are inspiring as well. I wouldn't say perfect, but I would say inspiring. Are there any questions?
So
Randy,
I have a question. I'll start. There were many more kings
yes,
along the way. They must have had queens, or we assume they had
right.
women,
Right.
but they're not mentioned, obviously.
So that's what we were talking about. I mean, I was trying to think about before in terms of defining the terms, right? When I was giving the example of, Queen Elizabeth II married to Prince Philip as opposed to King Philip, right? So the idea is there, when I try to think about queens, I was talking about people who had any kind of power of her own. As I said, in the Bible, aside from Vashti and Esther, as far as I can tell, the term queen isn't even used. But it's a female ruler who had been married to the king, who has able to exert power. And of that, we only have those two examples of Jezebel and Atalia. And they're negatives. And like I said, though, in a patriarchal system, when later the rabbis would codify the queens aren't even allowed at all, maybe it's not a surprise that their positives weren't asserted. Like, these were complex people, just the way we're complex people. All of us have some good and bad in us, hopefully more good than bad. So there actually is one Midrash that I found that I didn't share with us about some of the positives of Jezebel. There was this idea, even though sorry to mention again, but how the dogs ate up most of her corpse, that somehow the parts that were left as in the merit of some good deeds that she had done. Something about, I forget the example, giving honor, I think, to a bride and a groom who had, come by on the road past the palace or something like that. And that's why her feet were preserved, because she had used her feet to walk out and, and celebrate with the bride and the groom, for instance. So, there's one rabbinic
Okay.
idea there about getting some positives, but, mostly negatives.
Okay, so now we have questions.
Good.
Judy's going to ask a question now. That's what I'm told. Anna, you said Judy's going to ask a question now?
So she has to be unmuted. Oh, I see her hands up. So you guys have to unmute her.
Yeah, Judy, you wanted to ask a question, so why don't you unmute?
Yeah. Hold on a second, and I want to have to unmute.
You are.
You are.
Okay. What do the Ethiopians do when they celebrate this holiday?
Oh, it's a whole other amazing thing that I've only learned about recently myself. It doesn't have to do with women, the holiday. It has to do with it's like a completion of it. There's an aspect of repentance around it. I think it happens a certain number of days after Yom Kippur, and there's some. So it's it's either 30 or 40 days. I forget which it is after Yom Kippur. That's the date of it. And so it's connected to the idea of repentance, also kind of like completing repentance. And then I think there was also a great longing for Zion also, which they were longing to come back to Israel even before they knew there was a modern state of Israel. So I think that's part of it. But you can look it up. It's spelled Sigd. That's why I don't know how to pronounce it. Sigd. And I think it's actually been declared a national holiday in Israel now, which is lovely. And a lovely way of, supporting and honoring the Ethiopian Jewish population.
I
think there is a whole lot to be learned about the Ethiopian Jewish,
I'm sure.
experience that we don't know.
I'm sure. And I'm not the right person to teach it to you, but there are people out there.
My daughter spent a few months there a few years ago and came back with some really fascinating stories about a whole underground that's still kind of there and their experiences, and not a lot that we've heard of. So, okay.
And I love the way their traditions evolved differently. They had no conception of rabbinic Judaism as we do. They are from biblical Judaism, evolved from there, which from my view, that's the part that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, interesting. Okay, so a couple of other questions. Why wouldn't Salome's firstborn son be assumed to be her heir?
Oh, so this is the thing about part of their Hellenization, their adopting of their Greek kind of traditions, involved really perverting the idea of the high priest, and that the high priesthood, since its inception with Aaron in the desert, was always meant to be hereditary, passed down from father to son in certain families of Kohanim. They, in a power play, switched it up and changed it to be, a different kind of political leader that involved money and bribery and all kinds of, inappropriate things in general, especially having to do with the temple. So there was kind of a split of power between kingship and high priesthood. And I think the two sons were kind of back and forth on like who would be in charge of what, or one in charge of both. And it was that kind of greediness about the type of leadership that both were actually not really acceptable Jewishly anyway, but it's the way the world was going at that time that led to the infighting, and it led to one of them, I forget which one, basically, like when there's two kids that are like, they get in a fight and one like, oh, I'm going to run and I'm going to go and find dad and he's going to settle this for us. So they did. They went to the superpower of the region and essentially then invited Rome into the Jewish political system,
We never learned.
right, which then ended eventually in the destruction of the temple by the Romans.
Wow. Okay, I've got one more. How did the Rambam statement in his Mishna Torah?
Yes.
Oh wait, I've got a couple more. Okay, anyway, how did the Rambam statement in his Mishna Torah relate to Goldin Meir becoming PM of Israel?
I was hoping someone was going to ask this one. This is a complex Jewish halachic question that was not at all a given in the beginning of the state of Israel. As we know, the modern state of Israel is a democracy. As we know also, not all modern democracies enabled women to vote or run for office at the beginning of their democracies or even into the 20th century. So the whole idea about, and then even in other countries, democracies, there were halachic decisions made by rabbis, people who were modern Orthodox, like modern enough to want to vote in an election, but Orthodox enough to go to the rabbis for advice, decisions about whether women could be involved in the political process or not from a halachic perspective. So there are actually extensive discussions of this halachically, going back to the 19th century, not even having to do with Israel. So it's very complex. So it is complex in terms of this particular situation, is then extended or related to something called srara. It's a very complex halachic discussion about basically that women shouldn't be too uppity and shouldn't really be in positions of power like that. And interestingly, on a personal perspective, I was involved not so many years ago already, maybe 15 years ago, when I was on the board of Shir Shemaim Orthodox Synagogue in Toronto. It was in their constitution to not allow a woman to be the president of the shul because of this halacha that's related to all of these things. By extension, the rabbis and the original founders of the shul extended it to mean even the president of the shul. The rabbi at the time, this Rabbi Moshe Shulman, was able to get a halachic permission after researching it to allow women to become the president of the shul. But then they had to deal with the legalities of working in a nonprofit in Canada, that there was a constitution of the synagogue that needed, in order to change the constitution, they need to have a 90% vote, positive vote of the leader, of the membership.
Right.
So people got on the phone, people went to Baycrest where there were members living, people worked very hard and were able to change the constitution. And that's when I believe it was Charlene RJ was the first female president of the shul. And so, but it was something that was in the constitution that was originally there because of the understanding of this halacha, and by extension, the idea that women shouldn't be too kind of uppity in a public way, which would mean, has been interpreted in the past as being involved in the halachic process, including obviously some decisions, some decisors regarding the Prime Minister of Israel, but thank God not all.
I have no words. I mean, here we are in 2021 and we're still struggling with this.
Right.
We're
Well,
still
I think it's
struggling.
important to understand where we've come from in order to understand sometimes about how far we have to go.
Yeah. And as you probably know, Adath Israel has recently gone through some very major discussions and
Right.
Made some very interesting decisions and hard ones. And
Right.
A lot of this has to do with all of that and all of those attitudes, but we also live in this world. So it's a ongoing discussions.
That's right.
Anybody else before we say goodbye? Does
I
anybody
see
have any?
someone corrected me with something to do with British history, which I
Oh,
know
yes.
nothing about. I only know about the current queen, and that she's married to someone not named the king. So I'm just a very happy to learn about from I see in the chat
I think the discussion is whether the
more
wife
of
of a king was called a queen or the husband of a queen was called the king. And
I know there's just like we have lots of halacha, they have lots of
Oh,
their own
yeah.
type of halacha
yeah,
in terms of
Mhm.
how that works.
and that's
I
certainly being challenged these days too.
That's right. I
look
just shared for people in case you're interested, a little self-promotion, but also promotion of Jewish women. As many of you know, I shared this last time also, but that we are in midst of the calendar period called the Omer, when we count the Omer every day. And on Instagram, I'm counting the Omer by highlighting something to do with Jewish women every day that's connected to the number of that particular day. So if you want to follow that on Instagram, you'll continue to learn more about Jewish women. Okay, I see their hands up. Are their hands up? Is that on purpose?
Yes, I think that
Okay,
Bernard
then
has a question.
go ahead, please. Oh no, is that the one about the correction about, or is there something else?
I don't know.
Yeah,
There we go.
the whole thing is really very interesting.
Oh,
And I
okay.
think that the situation with British monarchs does derive from Jewish law.
Oh, could be.
I think so. There was this big issue, like it's hard to find a parallel, but Queen Mary married Philip of Spain, and he was king. But the difficulty was that the English law at that time would have given him, as her husband, all the power and the wealth and the rights and so on.
Oh.
So there had to be a special marriage act in
Ah,
which he was still called King of England, but he
Oh.
did not hold the rights as Mary's husband. So
I mean, everything we talked about, the importance of titles or not titles, making assumptions,
Right.
marriages, bloodlines, intrigue. Of course,
Inheritance.
in British history, there's plenty of other, intrigue and war and everything also. So, not to say democracy is exempt from any of that either. We have lots of problems with democracy too sometimes. But
the issue came even more to the fore with Victoria.
Oh, okay.
Right. And there's this ongoing series about Victoria's life and her reign and so on. So that's one thing. But I also wanted to say
Yes.
something about the whole issue of patriarchy.
Yes.
There is a Jewish movement, if you like, a denomination called Kohenet. I don't know if you've heard of them, Anna.
I do.
And they have very seriously challenged Jewish patriarchy and have tried to roll back, if you like, or make more well-known and prominent Jewish history with regard to women. And they even, what's the word I want? When someone is made a rabbi,
Ordained.
They ordain women as priestesses. And as it happens, my youngest daughter was ordained and is a Kohenet. And for a few years, believe it or not, worked as a Jewish chaplain in the men's federal prison in Canada. So this is a relatively new thing.
Yes, very
and
new.
I think the founders or the founder, who is a woman rabbi of the Kohenet movement, is still alive. And so we're still dealing with the first generation of Kohenet women. That's a very interesting development, I think.
yes, it is. It's very niche, as is almost everything we're talking about here. Yeah, I've never met anyone that knows anyone that's part of it, actually. But I do talk about it, and I teach a course, a chat on gender and Judaism. And that's how Rabbi Cutler knows that my connection to all of this information and things like that, for one of the ways I'm connected to him. And I am familiar with the organization through their website only. I have not met anyone in person. There is, for me as a historian, it's a little bit difficult for me personally, because there has, the concept of the priest in the temple is something that is very historically male, yes, but also limited. Like we have Kohanim, that get the first Aliyah, for Torah reading nowadays. But aside from that, it is something that's very, very particular to Temple Judaism. And Temple Judaism is gone, with the destruction of the Second Temple. The rabbis came to the fore, put together the Mishnah, put together the Talmud, all of the traditions and ideas and everything that we really, celebrate as Jews on day-to-day life. We're no longer biblical Jews, we're rabbinic Jews. And so the idea is that this is something that's very much based in a biblical mindset, which again, temple involves animal sacrifices and hierarchies that, like, as a woman in particular, I'm not as comfortable with. So just as a historian, and again, I've never met one in person, I only know from their website, but as a historian alone, and there's other religious issues, but talk to Rabbi Cutler about that, not to me. But as a historian alone, that's where my discomfort is, personal discomfort lies a little bit there, because I don't want to be a biblical Jew. It wasn't so great for women. It wasn't so great for our relationship with other people. I'm not interested in animal sacrifice. But
No,
that's me. That's me.
But
Other people are.
we have also broken away from rabbinic Judaism, right? I mean, even
I'm not sure that that's the case.
well, even in the yeshiva, what is it? The Elchanan Yeshiva at Yeshiva University.
That's right.
Right? They are ordaining women.
No, they're not ordaining women. They're ordaining women at Yeshiva Maharat. I know this for a fact because my daughter will be attending next year. And there's absolutely no attendance whatsoever, ordination in the mainstream Orthodox movement of women. It is in a small but wonderful organization called Yeshiva Chovei Torah and Yeshiva Maharat that is led by Rabbi Avi Weiss in Riverdale. And they are not ordaining women at Yeshiva University.
Okay.
But there are also ordaining women in Israel. That's a whole different story.
That's right. And going back to the British monarchy.
What are we talking about? We're talking about Jewish queens today.
We're going all over the place. And in the British monarchy, they've just now made it, in the last few years, that the first woman in line could become the queen rather than the first male. So, the world is changing all around.
The times they are changing.
We'll keep our eyes open. But I think for now, talking about time, I think we should say thank you to Anna. This was great. It's always interesting to see where the conversation goes. Yes. Not necessarily where we expect, but it's fun to see. I just want to remind everybody that next week there is no session. There's some issue, I don't remember. And then we will be back in 2 weeks and we will have 3 more wonderful sessions with Anna. And hope to see you there. So we'll see you all in 2 weeks, and thank you again.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.